5 events. The Berlin Conference was a conference held in 1884 and 1885 to discuss the policies of expansion in Africa. Organized by Otto von Bismarck, the other nations were becoming wary of the German craze of expansion, so Bismarck held a conference to create a policy of common trade in Africa. After the conference, many countries tried a lot harder to colonize Africa, and the craze of imperialism sped up. The Suez Canal was a canal that connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Opened in 1869, it allowed Europeans to travel to Asia without traveling around Africa. It allowed imperialism to travel to Asia, and it still stands today at 120 miles long, 79 feet deep, and 673 feet wide. The Treaty of Nanking was a treaty that ended the First Opium War. It was between Great Britain and Scotland and Ireland and the Qing dynasty. It was known to the Qing dynasty as the First Unequal Treaty because Britain had no obligations. The treaty helped change the entire framework of foreign trade between foreign countries and more civilized countries. The Boxer Rebellion was a rebellion between the Boxers, who were members of the Society of the Harmless Fists, whose goal was to drive out the foreigners in China. Because of this rebellion, most of civilized Europe responded very harshly and actually collapsed the government because it was way too weak from the imperialism itself. The Boer War was a war between the Boer government in South Africa and Britain. The Boers were an effective opponent because of their guerrilla tactics and how they ambushed the British. The Boers were eventually defeated, and surprisingly, Britain created a union of South Africa for the Boers, despite the war that the Boer people had sparked up themselves. The Afrikaners were the descendants of the Dutch that in 1835 migrated out of disgust to the British to the north, past Transvaal. This really upset the British and caused them to seize the Transvaal, but a Boer rebellion caused them to eventually leave it alone, and they named it the Independent South African Republic. The Fashoda Crisis was a conflict between France and Britain when France tried to take over the Nile to block out Britain from colonizing Africa. The Britain diplomatically won this dispute and caused France to try and assert itself in areas susceptible to British influence. And around this time of imperialism, Britain had been in control of India since the 19th century. They had crushed a revolt in 1858, and now they led India directly. They brought India together despite previous civil wars and religious tensions, and they also brought them Western technology such as banks, railroads, industrialization, and overall, India was improved a lot from imperialization, but certain countries hadn't, and certain countries kind of did, like Japan, which after the Samurai Revolt in 1867, the newly crowned emperor Mutsuhito decided to restore Japan in an event called the Meiji Restoration, where Japan was modernized by the government adopting Western methods and sending thousands of people to get Western educations. Through this, Japan decided to, kind of take in the different methods of different countries, such as they took in a German-style army, a British-style navy. They copied the industrial and financial methods of the U.S., and they also developed a French-style administrative system and the social principles of the French. The Opium Wars, or the Anglo-Chinese Wars, were the overflow and tension between the Chinese and the imperializing Great Britain. Divided into two wars, the First Opium War was waged over the opium trade. The Second Opium War was also waged over the opium trade, but this time France was now fighting with Britain. These wars improved trade and were ended by the Treaty of Nanking. And overall, it really just improved the foreign trade from the imperialized countries in Europe overall exponentially.
A justification many Europeans used for imperialism was the moral obligation to civilize ignorant native peoples. This is well expressed in a poem called The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. Henry Stanley was a Welsh-American journalist and explorer. He explored Central Africa in search for David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary and explorer. He became famous for the line, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," known for his discoveries and development in the Congo. He sparked popular interest in Central Africa and was later knighted. Leopold II was the King of Belgium who colonized Central Africa with great excitement. To open to civilization the only part of our globe where it has not yet penetrated, to pierce the darkness which envelopes whole populations, is a crusade, if I may say so, a crusade worthy of the century of progress. Although he said this, he did think that money was over progress. He was really harsh to the Africans, and other European countries condemned him for his actions. He created the International Association for the Exploration and Civilization of Central Africa in 1876. He then began to make Belgian settlements in the Congo. Japan avoided Western intrusion until 1853 to 1854. American naval forces under Commodore Matthew Perry forced Japan to grant the U.S. trading and diplomatic privileges. This eventually led to the tension that fueled Pearl Harbor. As a response to the Boxer Rebellion, Allied forces from Britain, Germany, Russia, France, America, and Japan attacked Beijing to restore order and command more concessions from the Chinese government. This weakened the government so much that Sun Yat-sen was able to overthrow the Manchu dynasty with forces in 1912. He used a program of nationalism, democracy, and socialism. The new Republic of China stayed weak. Old imperialism had the motto of God, glory, and gold. New imperialism was used for raw materials, while old imperialism was for precious metals and goods that could not be produced. The colonies in new imperialism were used for markets for manufactured goods. Old imperialism was mostly a Roman Catholic zeal, while new imperialism was more humanitarianism and the moral responsibility to civilize the ignorant. Old imperialism took place in Africa, Asia, and America, while new imperialism took part in Africa and Asia. Old imperialism had aspects of exploration and commercial revolution, while new imperialism had aspects of industrial revolution. Before 1880, Europe controlled little of Africa. Independent states were left alone and Westerners only controlled trade. During the last 2 decades of the 19th century, Europe scrambled for Africa, beginning with Britain taking Cape Town. During this time, social Darwinism became very popular. In the struggle between nations, the fit are victorious and survive. The superior race must dominate the inferior with military force to prove its power. The sun never sets became a famous quote. It meant that the sun never set on an empire because it had colonies all around the globe, so the sun was always shining on some territory of the imperial power. It was first used to refer to the Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th century, then to the British in the 19th century and early 20th century, and eventually to the American power in the 20th century. Britain received Hong Kong in 1842 through the Boer War and trading rights for some Chinese cities. Other Western countries also wanted these rights, which China tried to resist and failed. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the US, and Japan created spheres of influence. In 1899, they agreed to an open door policy, brought up by John Hay, where one country would not restrict the commerce of the others in its sphere of influence.